also.
Okay.
So thank you and very welcome, Michael, from all the way to Norwegian Aviation Museum, and you will tell us about Bf 109 restoration. So please welcome, and you are ready to start.
Thank you. So, as you heard, my name is Michael Loftus. I am the Objects Conservator at the Norsk Luftfartsmuseum, up here in Rudder. So I cannot see my presentation. Hopefully you guys can. Can you still see it?
No, I see some kind of video,
Right.
some other guys, someone.
Yes, I see the inside of somebody's room.
Yeah, please, if someone try to share something, switch off, please.
This is Jan Olav. If you can hear us, Jan Olav, can you switch off your camera?
Okay, can you take now the?
I hope so. There we go. Yeah, there you go. So I am the Objects Conservator up at Norsk Luftfartsmuseum in Rudder. I am responsible for the care of collections, the conservation of objects, activity in the workshop, and I'm also involved in collecting. And for those of you who don't know, we are Norway's National Museum for Aviation. We are in fact 3 museums in one. We are Luftforsvarsmuseet, who are responsible for collecting the military aviation used in Norway. We are also Norsk Luftfartsmuseet, who are responsible for conveying the history of civil aviation in Norway. And we are Avinor, who are the operators of Norway's airports. They financially support the museum, and in return, we collect objects that portray the history of the organization and the development of the airport network within Norway. So they collect, or we collect, such objects as the fire engines, operational equipment, and air traffic control equipment. We are underpinned by the Rudder Luftfartshistorisk Forening, who you'll be hearing much about in this talk, and from here on in will be known as the BLOF. Here they are in Finnmark with the recovery of a Focke-Wulf 58. They are a voluntary organisation that has conducted the majority of the technical work to the airframes in the collection, both civil and military. They have a special relationship with many of the objects, having first researched them, found them on the mountainsides or in the fields, recovered them, brought them back to Rudder and restored them. This makes them true experts on the collection, and the history of the BLOF cannot be separated from that of the museum. It will become clear that you cannot talk about our Messerschmitt 109 project without explaining a little bit about the formation of the museum. So it was a difficult start to the museum, with many disagreements which still resonate today. Our location in the north is still a problem for some. A lot of methods of work used in the early days contrast with what we may now think of as good museum practice. There are some fault lines as a consequence of our structure, these 3 museums in one structure, and it is of course not always possible to please everybody all of the time. And although there is more that binds us, these divisions are still present, and for example, there is a bit of a us and them mentality between us and the volunteers, but I'm sure this is a familiar tale to many organisations. But the focus of the presentation today will mainly be on our recently completed Bf 109 and how it got from this on the left to what you see on the right. How it all started. I will give a chronological run through of the project, some of the achievements and the difficulties along the way, and what we might do differently if we had our time again. I will also talk a little bit about the concept of originality and what this can mean to different people. And after this, time allowing, I will also take the opportunity to update you on other projects and new arrivals, as I've been very busy collecting recently at the museum. So to the main event, I must be very clear about my level of involvement in the 109 project. I was a late arrival in the story, with the aircraft having been at the museum for several years before I appeared. The project was in the advanced stages, so I made no attempt to impose a new direction, but assisted when required, mostly with handling and assembly. So how did it all begin? Why this aircraft? Why Yellow 3? Well, as mentioned, the history of the BLOF, the 109 and the museum cannot be separated out. And in the mid-1980s, a decision had been made to build a National Aviation Museum in Rudder. The armed forces made a list of desired aircraft types, the big hitters to include the Junkers 88, Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt 109, and the BLOF were formed to serve this dream. So how did we end up with Yellow 3 and what was the plan? Well, the answer to that is easy. It was then and still is now the only complete 109 wreck to be found in Norway. So this is our first encounter with the meaning of original. Yellow 3 is the genuine article with wartime history in Norway, and it is not a wreck taken from elsewhere and dressed to represent. In this sense, Yellow 3 is original. The following text comes directly from Gunnar Koch, who is the leader of the BLOF. He delivered this content as part of the opening ceremony for the exhibition. It was difficult for me to decide how to present this. Should I just read it out, or should I develop it and interject with my own ideas? I've decided to not do the latter because it is best to be clear about who is speaking. My only addition will be the explanation of some of the images. But I will, however, read after the text from Gunnar, using the concept of originality to talk about what might be done differently. So now I am Gunnar. The story of the Messerschmitt Bf 109 G2 Yellow 3. The story begins a long time ago with a number of people with an interest in aviation and aviation history. They each began to collect flight history, seek out wrecks, and write down the history of the crashes. They came together as the Norwegian Aviation History Association, which in 1978 established a northern Norwegian branch. They began to systematically register wrecks and wreck sites, and this is what that looked like. Here they are in Finnmark, collecting parts of a Junkers 52. Finnmark has been a very good source of material for the museum. Here is the living conditions. It looks idyllic, but I've been told the mosquitoes were always hungry. And here they are at a separate Junkers 52 site, also in Finnmark. In the 80s, the first thoughts about a Norwegian aviation museum began to take shape. In 1985, the Defence Museum made a list of its warplanes that should be displayed in a future museum. And on this list was a Messerschmitt 109. And from then on, the plane was on the agenda. In the years that followed, the enthusiasts in the north conducted an extensive search and rescue operation in collaboration with the armed forces and the Defence Museum. At that time, Øystein Skar and Jan Eriksson had been able to borrow a room in Budafoss Airport, where they had established a store for the historic aviation parts they had collected. Many of these parts were to be later used in Yellow 3. Following the establishment of a National Norwegian Aviation Museum, the BLOF was founded. The association opened a workshop and club premises in Mollevien. This is a dockside premises near the centre of Bule. And a few years later, the Norwegian Aviation Museum was completed, and here you can see the building nearing completion. The enthusiast community now had an organisation that could collect and restore aircraft wrecks, and a museum that would take care of the restored aircraft. In the years that followed, the BLOF and the museum conducted extensive collecting of civilian Russian, British, American, and German wrecks in northern Norway. The collection of German wrecks was not viewed with kind eyes by the Defence Museum, which claims that they had the monopoly on the collection of German wrecks, and asked the BLOF to keep their hands off. The civilian side of the Aviation Museum accused the Defence Museum of not telling the story of the air war in Norway, especially in the north, and claimed that as a public institution, they had as much right as the Defence Museum to preserve what was state property. This is why the Civil Aviation Museum, Norsk Luftfartsmuseet, engaged in military aircraft projects such as the Junkers 88, Blackburn Skua, and Messerschmitt 109. If the Air Force would not show the story, then we would have to do it. In 1996, Børge Larsen was hired as a curator at the Aviation Museum. Among the types of aircraft he began working with was a 109, and it dawned on him very early that the museum had accumulated a significant surplus stock of wrecks that could be used as a means of exchange to have services performed abroad. In 1997, he talked to Christian Vanhee from Belgium about exchanging a Junkers 88 parts for 109 parts. 2 years later, he was in contact with aircraft assemblies on the Isle of Wight in England about building a replica 109, incorporating some parts from Norway. And in 1999, Børge ordered the first part, the firewall, from Classic Aero Services in England, and this was eventually to find its way into Yellow 3. But in 2002, the case took a new turn. The Aviation Museum made an agreement with the Deutsche Technik Museum in Berlin to exchange one Junkers 88 wreck in payment for restoration work done to our Junkers 88. In an additional agreement, the Deutsche Technik Museum was to pay for the construction of a set of 109 wings at the Karl Bergzok's workshop in Herag, Hungary, in return for yet more parts of Junkers 88. In Kirkenes, the Grenseland or the Borderland Museum had built up a significant stock of wrecks from World War II, and in 2005 they decided they would no longer collect such material and gave the collection to Norsk Luftfartsmuseet. Included in these parts was the centre section of a 109 with work number 13470. The museum decided that 13470 should be our 109. And when you look at the wreckage, you have to be very optimistic and anything but fearless to try and turn something like that into an aircraft. The following year, Børge Larsen and Jan Eriksson visited the Herbert Hartmeer workshop near Munich and ordered the plate parts to form the rear fuselage for 13470. These parts were very difficult to make in our own workshop at the time, and they cost 85,000 Norwegian kroner. These are not the actual parts, but an example of the quality of work available from the Hartmeer workshop. When we entered the year 2009, we had wings, we had the rear fuselage on order, as well as the wrecked centre section of 13470, along with some wrecked engine parts and a number of other smaller parts that had already been restored. These parts came from Loftus. Then the case took a new turn again. Folla Diving Club in Røvik knew that in 1943, a Bf 109 landed between the islands in Risvær, Trøndelag. They had searched for the wreck with conventional equipment without success. But in August 2009, they received help from an ROV with a camera, and after a 5-hour search, they found the plane planted in the seabed, nose first, at a depth of 60 meters. They reported the find to the Norwegian Aviation Museum, where Børge Larsen immediately saw the possibilities. They had found Yellow 3, a Bf 109 G2 R6 with work number 14649. It was built by Weirne Noordstade Vlugswerke in late autumn of 1942 and was delivered to service in Norway near Trondheim. On March the 24th, 1943, the plane was out on a training trip. It lost engine oil and had to make an emergency landing at sea. The pilot, who you see pictured here, the then 21-year-old Gunther Seraphim, put the plane down between the islands in Risvar. Two locals, Olette Bliko and her son Berger, had seen the emergency landing and came calmly to the rescue in a small rowing boat. Seraphim did not survive the war, as he was shot down and killed on April the 10th in 1945. So Berger Larsen rejoiced at having found a next to complete wreck and considered that despite the corrosion damage, it would be a good starting point for rebuilding. The Aviation Museum, the civil side, Norsk Luftfartsmuseum, took ownership from the Defence Museum, and the aircraft was recovered at Pentecost 2010. Berger Larsen knew that salvaging a sea wreck requires many hands, so invited everybody with an interest. And among those to accept the invitation were some aviation interested police officers from Mo i Rana, but more on those guys later. The recovery was carried out in collaboration with Folla Diving Club. They had contacts in Norway Aqua Service and provided professional deep sea divers and the service vessel Camilla for the lift. Berger Larsen had designed special straps so that the divers would attach to the wreck for the lift. So on the right hand side you can see the curved structures. They were to be placed at the wing root leading edge to provide support in that very strong point. And the green you see on the drawing at the bottom was a webbing straps to support the engine as it was recovered. On the day of the uplift, many boats made the trip out to Risvar because word had spread. The divers went down and connected the equipment and the lifting straps, and 2 hours later, the wreck started to appear, very overgrown with seaweed. When the plane came loose from the bottom, the crane weight showed 10 tons, well up on our expected 6 tons. During the unloading on the quayside in Rudder, the fuselage broke. Understandably, this was a real downturn moment, but the disappointment passed quickly. The fuselage had been beaten in the emergency landing, and corrosion had weakened the structure so much so that it was hardly suitable for restoration. So the loss was not great. On the contrary, dismantling and transport home was made easier. On the quayside, the plane was cleaned and dismantled as far as possible. Most of the parts were transported home on trailers, but the wings, however, due to their size, were sent home by boat. Participating in raising the wreck was the museum's photographer, Björn Eriksson, who documented the operation and whose pictures you are now seeing. In total, there was an increase in budget of 55,000 Norwegian kroner, including 30,000 for mixed gas for the divers. According to the agreement, Norway Aqua Service was to receive 50,000 kroner for the renting of the service vessel Camilla, but as they'd enjoyed themselves so much raising the aircraft, they forgave the amount. It was now clear that the museum's 109 would no longer be 13470, but would be Yellow 3. The 13470 project was aborted and all parts exchanged in return for assembly of the Yellow 3 aft section by the Hartnir workshop in the same jig that you saw in the photograph before. Well, at home, the hectic work began to clean and disassemble the aircraft parts before the screws corroded. And here is an example of the condition of the parts that came to Buda. In retrospect, it can be admitted that we should have spent more time on registration, documentation and systemization, but sometimes you do not have time for everything. The engine was partly dismantled. A fracture was found in the rocker arm, which you can clearly see the damage in this photograph. And we have been told that this is typical for an engine which has lost oil. So we fast forward a little bit, and the first part of the aircraft to be completed was the tail section and rudder. At the time when Yellow 3 was raised, Karl Bergsack's workshop in Hungary had another 109 under construction for a different customer. They lacked the drawings of the tail and asked if they could borrow ours. The deal was done. They were to use parts from ours for pattern making, and in return they would refurbish ours. Is a photograph of inside the workshop in Hungary. But at Ruvik, we had gotten to know the policeman from Mo i Rana, and it turned out they had experience with both restoration of cars and engines. Berger Larsen asked if they could undertake the restoration of the engine, which they said they could. They borrowed a workshop from Momek and got started. The engine fitted to Yellow 3 today is made up of parts from several engines. The steel parts from Yellow 3 were fine and could be reused. They had been protected by the magnesium and the aluminium parts. The engine block came from a barter with Christian van Hee in Belgium. It had suffered some fractures that required welding, but one of our volunteers, Björn Meyer, was able to do this. And of course, it can be quite difficult welding these cast constructions like this, but not for Björn. He makes this type of work look easy. The original block had major corrosion damage, and the alloy had become self-destructive after many years in the water. The magnesium parts had dissolved. They were replaced by newly cast aluminium parts from Edvald Keller, a workshop in Germany. Outside, the parts looked very good, but inside they were not so good. This is the reason why it was not possible to refit everything into the front and rear gearboxes and also under the valve covers. And here you can see the components being faced, so they came fitted together correctly. Parts were also taken from Yellow 3's engine and refitted, as mentioned, the Ferris parts. Meanwhile, back in Bule, the biggest job was to rebuild the cockpit section. So it was picked apart. The steel parts again could be reused, but the aluminium parts were damaged by corrosion, so instead were used as templates for pattern making and exact copies. And here you can see the original parts being used to map out where to drill the holes for the rivets on the new plate. And we can see that process unfolding here with the center section being built up and coming together. Meanwhile, the rear fuselage, the aft fuselage, was returned to us from the Hartneer workshop, and it was connected to the center section and fitted perfectly. So this shows the quality of the work done by both workshops, and I especially enjoy this inside shot, which shows the two halves coming together. Again, perfect fit with no adjustments required. The center spar was restored in-house. The top and the bottom sections, again being made of steel, were minimally corroded and were reused. Here is Ivan, one of our long-term volunteers, who expertly reconstructed the aluminium parts. In the summer of 2016, the spar could be mounted onto the fuselage, and then it rolled out as one assembly on its own wheels. In 2016, there was a 2-year break in restoration. The museum's civilian exhibition was to be rebuilt, and work on other aircraft had to be given priority. When the new exhibition was completed, the restoration took another turn, as the Air Defence Museum now wanted the aircraft in its exhibition. They took ownership of Yellow 3 back again, and it became a priority task. There were good finances and project organisation that worked well. The BLOF paid all expenses and received regular reimbursement from the Armed Forces Museum. What was left now was assembly of the aircraft and reconstruction of smaller parts. So here you can see the empennage, the tail section going on to the rear fuselage and some of the markings going on to the aircraft. And also here is an example of some of the smaller parts that were rebuilt in-house. So this is the oil tank, and the mounting brackets were taken from the original, which you see in the middle, and welded onto a reconstruction, a newly built oil tank, and the form you see at the top was the wooden form used to make the tank. Parts from other aircraft were used. For example, this is the box over the gun in the cockpit. This was adapted from a F model. Other new parts were made in-house. For example, these wire termination for the control cables into the wings, small but essential. Other parts were too complicated for our workshop, and so they were traded for or bought in from other workshops. For example, the gun pods. This approach had its pros and cons, as the workshop in Hungary, who had minimal respect for agreed delivery times, it ended up with a lot of fuss. The wings that were sent for restoration in 2011, for example, were not returned to us until 2019, but the workshop had indeed done fine work. Many parts were completely missing. Very often the originals were totally damaged by corrosion. This is me now speaking. I thought that this time I'd like to mention Sten Ibar, who sadly died and is no longer with us, but he was our in-house expert on all things German and electric. So here he is cleaning out old parts and recycling what he could for the restoration. New parts were exchanged with collectors and other museums. We had especially good collaboration with the Aviation Museum at Sula, Stavanger in Norway, who were simultaneously restoring a 109 G2. So lots of conversations with those. Other items were purchased at the fair in Speyer or off eBay. The missing weapons came from the Defence Museum, and getting the right parts is not always so simple, as the 109 came in many variants and it is easy to get the wrong part. And unfortunately, on a couple of occasions, we came to mount a part that did not belong to a G2 model, an example of this being the upper wing cowling. As a personal note from me, fitting the guns was not easy, and it was clear that we would not have made a good ground crew during the war, the amount of time it took us to put those things in. But when it comes to collecting of parts, you cannot avoid class. Here he is pictured with the canopy that was to be used on the LO3. The original was lost at sea, as Seraphim would have removed it prior to bailing out of the aircraft. Class has a special ability to obtain parts from collectors and wreckage. He is perhaps one of the museum's biggest contributors and has provided many of the parts for Yellow 3. The propeller can stand as an example of this. The propeller blades were found in a ditch in Bulfoss. The spinner consists of a backplate found in Kirkenes and a middle section found in Roan in Trondelag on a trip from Sula Museum passed on to class. We needed a new hub because the museum wanted to keep the original curved propeller assembly as it was for display. We will revisit this later on. The new hub was obtained by trading parts with Sky Jens Moog in Germany. Assembling an aircraft, as I'm sure many of you know, is not easy. Manuals and parts catalogues do not always provide the answers on how the parts should go together. So two study trips were therefore made, one to Sula and the other one to the RAF Museum at Cosford to look at Black 6, a plane that has a reputation for being properly restored. And here we are, looking very pleased of ourselves after having been granted unrestricted access to look at what we wanted on Black 6. So many thanks to Darren Brille and Cosford. Adjusting parts is difficult. What caused the most problems were the engine covers and the wing root fairings. The engine covers come from multiple wrecks and parts also fabricated in-house, and this required a lot of adjustment with many attempts at fitting before they eventually settled over the engine. The parts for the wing root fairing were made in the workshop by Karl Bergsack in Hungary, but finished in our workshop. The skin had first been to Sula, where it could not be made to fit their aircraft, but it then came to us where we managed to persuade it to fit ours. One of the biggest surprises for us was the pipes and the hoses for the engine oil system. Here we have students from Flyfag helping us fit that system. Flyfag is an aviation technical school next to the museum, and activities like this complement their education, as they do not concentrate on piston engine technologies in their studies. So we started in good faith that the layout should be as a standard G2 model, but we're very surprised to discover that the layout was in fact that of an F model, and it became obvious the factory must have used up parts of the F model before they started on the newer G model parts. Other milestones included the fitting of systems inside the fuselage. Here is Kjetil Lund installing hydraulic lines, navigation and radio equipment, and this gives you a good idea of the level of completeness achieved in this project. The engine fitting, this went quite smoothly with good preparation. Here you can see we had the addition of an aircraft jack at the front around the propeller shaft to, because we had the aircraft in a rigging position, we were unsure whether we were going to tip it or not. So just to be sure, we put that at the front. Fitting the fuel tank. Now this is quite a remarkable thing. Oh, so here is the engine crew enjoying their moment. But so here you go. Here is the tank. So this is the actual original tank from Yellow 3, and finding a replacement would have been very, very tricky. And it is amazing how well this item cleaned up. Also, test fitting of the wings. Oh no, here we are, sorry. This is the tank being fitted, and it went in no problems. Test fitting of the wings for the first time. Again, this was quite a smooth operation. It's not the most difficult of tasks, but it was essential to do this before taking to exhibition in case there had some distortion. The aircraft has been crashed, of course. So another thing which is worth a mention is the textile work done to the control surfaces. Lucky for us, Kjetil is an ex-military surgeon and has exceptional needle skills. So he did this the right way, the more complex, time-consuming German way. And there are restorations of German aircraft using the more simple British and American way. And this is not strictly incorrect, as there are many examples of field repairs being done by Germans the simpler British American way. Painting of the aircraft. This was done in a military paint shop at Boudinlay, which is close to the museum. We used paint made according to the original recipe from Farben Kirov, but the primer is not historically correct. For example, on the fuselage, light blue RLM 76 top coat should have been used directly onto the bare aluminium, whilst both we and others have used modern primers. But many thanks to Ralph from Boudinlay for the painting work he did to the aircraft. Again, a good example of the great cooperation we have with the armed forces. The smaller markings were performed by Andrea Karstad, who is a conservator at the museum. The museum purchased a computer-controlled cutting machine to do the stencils in-house, and this was much more cost-effective than asking an external graphics firm to help us out with this. So the camouflage paint on the 109 is a hot topic. There is no 109 that is painted exactly according to RLM form. All are characterized by the painter's interpretation. The only safe reference were plates on the left side under the cockpit of our aircraft. We only have pictures from the recovery, and in those pictures the colour pattern is not easy to interpret. Unfortunately, the paint was sanded away when making copies of the plates, but we do have sections 6 and 10 of the tail that still have the paint remaining, but they are very dark and also difficult to interpret. There are pictures of a 109 with a number 3 that some have assumed are our yellow 3, but on closer study further details did not match. The camouflage paint is therefore a qualified guess. At the end of August 2020, the aircraft was completed and transported to the Norwegian Aviation Museum, where it will be exhibited in the Hillroom, or temporary exhibition room, for a year. And both the plane and the exhibition is something we can all be proud of. Finally, the aircraft will find its permanent home in the Armed Forces Museum. The BLOF has, in recent years, put in around 6,000 hours of a year, and in total we estimate that it has taken about 30,000 hours and the estimated cost of 800,000 kroner. So there ends the text from Gunnar, and I am now myself again. But before I go on to talk about other aspects of the project, I will talk a little about why is all of this important and why do we do it. There is, of course, the recording of technical history, the development of flight and its technologies. There is also the recording of war history and its impact on society and the act of memorialization. There are also the more personal stories of those involved, and for example, the rescue of the pilot, Gunther Serafim, by the Norwegian mother and son is perhaps the most heartwarming part of the history of the aircraft. An act of compassion and human connection in the midst of war. And here is Serafim on his return to the area to look for the wreck. And the boy we see in the picture is Berger, one of the rescuers. And as you can see, they appear to be very relaxed in one another's company. Despite surviving this episode, it does not end well for Serafim. He was recalled in defense of the realm back to Germany. He died when his plane was shot down and crashed south of Bremen on the April 10th, 1945. His body was found lying next to the aircraft, and he was then 23 years old. This restoration provided the opportunity for the brother of the pilot, Kurt Serafim, together with his 2 sons, Olav and Dirk, to come to Bodø to meet Roald Bliko, who is a relative of the rescuers. So the aircraft here was being used to bring people together. There are many examples of objects like our 109 being used in this way, providing a context and a forum for reconciliation. Before Yellow 3 goes to its permanent home on the military side of the museum, it has come to our temporary exhibition space, where we'll enjoy a different context, not surrounded by other aircraft, but it will be displayed with objects that talk about the impact of war, like this doll recovered from the war in Iraq, just north of Baghdad. This object is on loan from the Red Cross. The exhibition asks us to think about the flick of the switch moment when the warplanes appeared and change everything. So what would we do differently if we had our time again? The standout success of the project for me is the clear vision from day one of what the end product should be, a fully restored static aircraft. The debate will never end on what is the appropriate course of action for objects such as our 109. Although I totally respect the determination and clear goal of the project, it does conflict with my thinking as an objects conservator. My basic mission statement is to minimize material loss and thus preserve the historic authenticity and integrity of an object. This sounds simple until you try and do it, but could there have been a different approach for Yellow 3? As Gunnar has mentioned in his text, more time could have been spent at the quayside recording the aircraft's detail, especially its paint. And this has been the subject of much debate. It is the first thing you see when you view the aircraft, and arguably has high priority when deciding what the important parts of your object are. This has proven the point that preservation of original field material is of the utmost importance, as the best evidence is always the object. I understand the arguments that full restoration is a form of preservation. The clock is ticking as soon as material is taken from salt water, and unless action is taken, deterioration is immediate. But I also see the amount of material loss caused by a full restoration, and this is a heavy price to pay, as a lot of evidence is lost. Much of the original plating used for the patterns has not been returned or kept, and much of the material we do have no longer has the paint on it. As it became clear to me the lack of untouched parts from the LO3 and the emerging importance of what was left as a source of evidence, I embarked on conserving the fuselage section with the yellow 3 on it, as you see in the photograph here, and the propeller. As you can see, the paint loss over the years on dry land has been considerable. And from this photograph, you can see how brittle and unstable the remaining paint layer was. But as coronavirus took grip on the world, the museum closed, but luckily for me, work continued. So I took this section to my home workshop, and it served as my lockdown project. Before consolidating the paint, I mechanically removed as much corrosion as possible and cleaned away the wax oil which had been applied at the quayside. The process here was to first soften the paint with alcohol, which also improves capillary action, helping to draw in the consolidant under the paint. Afterwards, an acrylic resin, Paraloid B72, was applied. This further softens the paint, as it contains acetone and helps the paint sit flat again. You can, of course, overdo it and dissolve the paint away if you're not careful. But in this photo, I am flattening the paint for the final time using a sprung spatula and a Melanex barrier layer. You can see the whole area of yellow paint now sits flat and has been adhered to the aluminium surface. Cross sections of the paint were prepared by Andrea, and we analysed them with our basic USB microscope to see what we could see. This helps you determine how many paint layers there are. And in this section, you can see the blue undercoat followed by a darker layer, possibly a spot of camouflage. And then you can see the yellow on top of this. And the final layer is the wax oil. I previously thought the application of RLM 76 as a primer was not introduced until 1944, but as our aircraft dates from 1942, this is proof that they were doing it prior to that. Determination of original tone is unfortunately beyond simple microscopy. The paints are oil-based and will naturally change, and they usually darken. So the section is now displayed next to the aircraft, as you can see on the left-hand side of this photograph. So ignoring for a moment the challenge of desalinating a whole aircraft, and there have been many examples of this we can all go and read about, am I really suggesting this methodology of consolidation can be applied to a whole aircraft? Well, yes, I am, and I think it would be a good experiment to try. Well, what about all of the corrosion? With methods like I have described, you cannot eliminate all corrosion. This is true, but all the parts would still exist in their original found condition. And although there would be further loss due to corrosion, it is considerably less in comparison to the total loss of the pattern making process. But what about all of the systems? What about all of the technical details? I can't help but look at this aircraft as it was raised and see a complete object as it is. Well, how important are the systems? How important is the cockpit? Well, they're not important at all when you see an object in this state. There is enough. But the more you decide to restore an object, the more important they become, the more their absence is obvious as you move towards the concept of an operable object. There is unfortunately no one answer. It is not one or nor the other. And I have to say there is a relatively high percentage of material on yellow 3 still on yellow 3. And here is an example of the wing, where you can clearly see the corrosion pitting. And I am happy that the object carries these marks as a testament to where it has spent the majority of its existence. There are many other parts of yellow 3 that are original, for example, the miracle of the fuel tank, which we talked about in Gunnar's text. So what is an original part? Many restorations will take parts from the same aircraft type and call them original. They are contemporary, but they are not original. They come from elsewhere and therefore cannot have taken part in specific events and cannot bear the marks that witness those events. The more an object is added to, the more it departs from its found original state, and the less it can tell you about the specific life it had. On the other hand, the more wrecked and incomplete an object is, the less it can tell you about its intended use or technical detail. But on this basis, this decision was made to keep the propeller as it was with its bent over blades. And this is one hell of a witness mark, telling you about the incident that took the aircraft out of service, its collision with the sea. As you can see here, it's in good condition, the quayside, and the opportunity was taken to try and split the assembly whilst it was fresh out of the water before the corrosion would seize it up forever, as the hub was destined to be used in the restoration. One blade was rotated 180 degrees, and this is how I found it 10 years later. And here you can see the blade on the right is pointing down. So I attempted to rotate the blade back again. So many generations of experimental tools were made, like the one you see here, hanging a concrete block from a lever and clamp in an effort to try and gently turn it back again. But these broke and weren't up to the strain. So finally, I commissioned Maskinering, a local engineering firm, to fabricate this ring spanner for me. Made from cadmium steel and using hardened aircraft bolts for the teeth. The process was to clamp the propeller in our press. We can see then bring the bolts down to make contact with the work, and then tease it round with a hammer until eventually we were able to bring the blade back round. So the blade is now on a stand and is displayed on the entrance to the new exhibition with a projection of the wrecked aircraft behind it. And I am pleased to see these original parts forming part of the exhibition, and I do not think original parts in this condition are appropriate to fit to a full reconstruction like yellow 3. I do, however, still think of the alternative object had the emphasis been on conservation and not a reconstruction of a functional object. No project should be started without a vision and an end goal. In this case, the vision was of a complete aircraft to look as if it could be operated, and I commend the effort and the determination to making it so. To this end, we have a fine object that communicates very well to the public. So what am I saying? Am I saying no restoration ever? Well, no, I'm not. It is essential for any practicing conservator is knowledge of his materials, and it definitely helps to understand the structure of your object. You must understand what you're looking at. It is also an extreme position to take to say that there can only be restoration or there can only be conservation. And as a museum, we must be able to provide both of these and all points in between, depending on the requirements of your object. To this end, we must have active restoration projects. We must perpetuate the skills as an important part of the heritage of aviation. Some examples of the 109 projects that are standout for me are, as mentioned, the textile work done to the control surfaces. We all know that it's quite rare to find somebody who can correctly. The rebuilding of parts, that is combining new and old components to make an understandable whole again. Well, this is a truly alchemic process, and it is a real sight to behold. I'm quite annoyed I have misplaced photographs of this assembly in its original condition, but it's just a mangled ball of metal, and our Ivan unfolded it, understood it, and rebuilt it. There is also the sculptural appeal of the wing fairings with its complex compound curvatures and the amount of work just to adjust the shape slightly, a lot of cutting, rewelding. And there's also the beauty of the substructure beneath it, which now it is connected to the aircraft no one will ever see. And we would also, with only conservation, miss out on the very dramatic before and after shots like these from the cockpit. So I have no conclusion other than to thank all volunteers for the delivery of an excellent object, and I am sure that attempting to strike this balance in our collections in the future will continue to be a source of great pain and joy for many years to come. So I say I'm on 50 minutes, so I can end it there. I had other examples of other projects, but I think I'm on time.